Right there in her own company's lobby, a billionaire CEO put $750,000 on the table for anybody who could bring her son back from a meltdown. Doctors had already struck out. Specialists flown in from across the country had already struck out. A whole lineup of the precious child psychologists in the business stood there frozen while a 6-year-old boy sat crumpled on the marble, palms crushed against his ears, screaming like the whole world was ending. For him, right then, it was. Then the building's maintenance man, the one who fixes the boilers and pushes the mop bucket, the guy nobody in that tower could actually put a name to, set his toolbox down, walked over, and lowered himself onto the cold marble next to that boy. No touching, no trying to stop him, just sitting. A few minutes passed. He leaned in close and murmured a single word, and the screaming just stopped. Before I get to what that word was, before I explain how a janitor pulled off in 5 minutes what a fortune and experts couldn't manage in an hour, let me ask you something. If you've ever loved someone the world labeled broken and understood, way down in your gut, that they weren't broken at all, just fluent in a language nobody around them had ever bothered to learn, then stick around and subscribe. This channel exists for you, and whoever you love like that, that's the only ask. To make sense of that lobby, I have to start with my own kid. I'm Walter Nash, 47 years old, and maintenance is my trade. I'm the guy behind the wiring, the plumbing, the elevators, the 1,000 quiet things nobody registers until they break. Invisible work by design. Nobody knows you're there until something stops working. I made peace with that a long time ago. Being invisible, I learned, isn't the same thing as being unnecessary. Some of the most vital people in any building are the ones nobody could pick out of a lineup. I raised my son alone, and to really tell this story, you need to know him first, because he's the reason I could do what I did in that lobby, and the reason I'd have done it for free. His name's Caleb. 24 now, a grown man, though he wasn't always. For a long stretch of his childhood, Caleb didn't speak, profoundly autistic as a small boy. His first real word didn't come until he was almost 11. Even today, he chooses his words slowly, deliberately. Back then, people looked at my son and saw trouble. A kid who fell apart in checkout lines, who couldn't stand to be touched some days, who arranged his toy cars in exact formation and unraveled if one got nudged out of place, who slammed his palms over his ears at noises the rest of us barely registered. The world took one look and decided something needed fixing. Here's what I saw instead, and it's the key to this whole story. A complete, whole, perfect kid who happened to experience everything at full volume. Every light blinding. Every sound piercing, every clothing tag like sandpaper against his skin, every disruption to routine like the ground opening beneath him. Caleb wasn't damaged goods. He was overwhelmed, almost around the clock, by a world engineered for brains that don't work like his. What looked like a tantrum to everyone else was actually him drowning, trying to say so in the only vocabulary available to him. Learning that vocabulary took years. His mother, Joan, rest her soul, poured everything she had into loving that boy. But the toll of it wore her down eventually. The sleepless stretches, the public stares, the private mourning for the ordinary life we'd once pictured before we knew better. She passed when Caleb was 13. Since then, it's just been the two of us. I'll never speak against her, not once, and won't tolerate anyone else doing it either. Raising a child the world refuses to understand is a burden that barely splits in half between two people. She carried hers as far and as hard as anyone could. The parties he never got invited to. The relatives who murmured about spoiling him, about needing more discipline. The grief nobody warns you about, mourning the ordinary life you'd quietly pictured before reality set in. It grinds down even the toughest people eventually. So once it was just the two of us, I made myself a promise, to her memory, and to my boy, that I'd learn him completely, no matter the timeline, so at least one soul on this earth would always get him. That promise is where all my knowledge came from. Not a classroom, a promise, kept the hard way. Through those years of decoding my son, I picked up fluency in something most people never realize is even a language. Reading a nonverbal child. Understanding that the screaming itself carries meaning. Learning that you don't end a meltdown by piling on. More noise, more hands, more come on buddy, calm down, more concerned faces crowding in. You end it by subtracting, getting low, going quiet. Turning yourself into the one still, predictable fixed point in a world suddenly spinning out of control. The most powerful move you can make for a drowning child isn't grabbing him, it's climbing into the water beside him and going still. So he can see the water won't kill him. I learned to become a calm place. It's the only real skill I own, and it cost me 20 years to earn, and I wouldn't swap it for any framed certificate. I remember one night, Caleb was maybe 5. He'd been screaming close to 2 hours straight, and I'd already thrown every tool I had at it, which back then amounted to nothing useful. I'd tried all the wrong moves, holding him, shushing him, begging, "Please, buddy, please," made everything worse. Eventually, I just slid down the kitchen cabinets onto the floor, done. Stopped trying to fix anything. Just sat there quiet, out of options. Minutes later, my boy crawled across that kitchen floor and leaned his back against my arm. Not a hug. Hugs were off the table then. Just his back against my arm. And he went quiet too. I cried sitting on that floor at midnight. Because it hit me that I'd spent 5 years trying to drag him out of the water when all he'd ever needed was for me to stop flailing and sit down in it beside him. That night is where I really started learning his language. Losing my pride is what made the lesson stick. Every wrong move I tried first is exactly how I know the right one now. Now, the building. I keep the systems running at a corporate headquarters downtown. Glass tower. Lobby probably worth more than every house on my street combined. The company belongs to Renata Shah, CEO, founder. The whole empire is hers. I'd crossed paths with her maybe 3 times in as many years. The way you glimpse the people at the very top of a place like that. Brief. Distant. Never a conversation. To her, I was part of the building's furniture, walking around, and honestly, I hold no grudge over that. That's simply how those towers operate. Some names get engraved on the door, others get stitched onto a gray uniform patch, and the second group learns fast not to expect the first group to ever bother reading it. I'd stopped minding that a long time ago. There's an odd kind of freedom in being invisible. You catch everything because nobody performs for the furniture. I knew which executives treated the cleaning crew with respect and which didn't. I knew whose desk drawer hid a flask and whose cabinet hid a crayon drawing where no client would ever spot it. Being the man nobody notices teaches you a building's real character. What I'd pieced together about Renata Shah across those years was that behind the frosty public image of her empire sat a locked door in her personal life that no amount of money could pry open. What almost nobody knew, because she guarded it like a vault, was that she had a son. Theo, 6 years old, nonverbal, autistic, eerily close to where Caleb had stood 2 decades earlier. I gathered this the way I gather most things. Being invisible in rooms where important people talk like the maintenance man isn't present. Bit by bit, over months, I understood she rarely brought him to the office. That she'd spent a fortune on therapies and specialists, that there was an entire private world behind her public one, built entirely around the boy she was fighting for. I felt for her, quietly. The way you feel kinship with someone walking a road you already know by heart. But it wasn't mine to bring up, so I never did. Then came the day everything shifted. I couldn't tell you exactly what triggered Theo. With kids like that, sometimes it's something enormous. Sometimes it's a flickering light, or a smell, or simply too many days stacked on top of each other. I was up on the 4th floor rewiring a fixture when I heard it, and I knew that sound instantly. God, did I know it. The precise pitch of a nonverbal child completely overwhelmed. Not a tantrum, not a difficult kid acting out. A child in real pain, drowning, screaming because it's the only word he has access to. My spine recognized it before my brain caught up. I'd heard that exact sound from my own son 1,000 times over. I dropped my tools and headed down, because certain instincts you don't argue with. The lobby was chaos by the time I got there. Theo was curled up on that enormous marble floor, hands crushed over his ears, screaming, his whole body locked rigid. Surrounding him, a disaster built entirely of good intentions. 6 adults, at minimum, crowded in close. 2 therapists, a doctor, an assistant, and Renata Shah herself on her knees. This formidable woman completely unraveled, reaching toward her son, pleading, "Theo, baby, please, please, tell mommy what you need." And every one of them, with every desperate, loving, well-meaning gesture, was making it worse, piling on more voices, more hands reaching in, more anxious faces pressed close, stacking noise on top of a child already flooded past capacity. They were trying to yank a drowning boy out of the water by grabbing him all at once, and without realizing it, they were pushing him under. I'll give them credit. None of them were bad people, and none were even bad at their jobs, strictly speaking. Their credentials outmatched mine by miles. They genuinely cared. But every single one had been trained to manage behavior, to step in, to act, because standing still feels like failure, especially with a terrified, powerful mother watching and a very expensive clock ticking. So they kept doing, and every action was another demand on a nervous system already at capacity. A hand on the shoulder is input. A soothing voice is input. 6 worried faces leaning in is a flood of input to a child already drowning in it. They were smothering him with help. And the worst part is they'd have kept going for another hour with the purest intentions, because not one of them had ever learned what my son taught me. Sometimes the most loving, most skilled thing you can do is absolutely nothing, done deliberately, with your full attention, somewhere in that hour, because by the time I understood the scene, nearly an hour had already passed. Renata Shaw, out of sheer desperation, looked up at the circle of powerless experts and the growing crowd and said, with the frantic logic of a terrified parent who's already tried everything money buys, "I'll give $750,000 to whoever in this building can calm him down. Anyone, I mean it." A CEO's version of a scream. The only language left in her panic. Money hurled at a wall, hoping something might stick. Nothing did, of course, because the one thing that boy needed had no price tag. And the person capable of giving it wasn't anybody on her payroll. I stood at the edge of that crowd in my work clothes, my name patch on display, one none of them had ever bothered to read, and watched for about 30 seconds. I ran the math 20 years with Caleb had trained into instinct. This boy wasn't out of control, he was overwhelmed and surrounded. Every adult near him counted as an input. What he needed was subtraction, not addition. And I knew, not guessed, exactly what would help. Because I'd done this 10,000 times before on a kitchen floor with my own son. So I did something no maintenance man is supposed to do. I walked straight into the middle of all those important people and said, quiet, but certain enough that they actually froze. Everybody needs to step back, all the way back, right now, and stop talking. They stared at me like the furniture had spoken. The doctor started to protest, but Renata Shaw, and I'll respect her for this the rest of my days, looked at my face and saw something, some certainty she didn't have herself, and said, "Do what he says." Everyone back. They obeyed, and suddenly it was just me, a screaming boy, and a lot of newly empty space. I didn't approach him directly. First rule, you never invade. I lowered myself onto the marble a few feet from Theo, angled away rather than facing him head-on, because direct contact reads as a threat when you're overwhelmed. I stared at the same patch of floor he was staring at. And I went quiet. Bone quiet. I turned myself into the stillest, most unremarkable, most predictable object in that entire lobby. No reaching. No calm down. Nothing at all at first. Just becoming a calm place, the same way I taught myself to be one for Caleb through countless storms. And I waited, letting stillness accomplish what noise and hands never could. I want you to understand what that actually feels like from inside it, because from outside it looks like doing nothing. And it's genuinely one of the hardest things a person can do. Every instinct in your body, hearing a child screams back at you to act, reach, fix, stop it, because the sound cuts straight through your chest. Sitting still beside that, keeping your breathing slow and your face soft and your hands quiet while everything in you demands movement, that costs everything you've got. It isn't passivity. It's the most active kind of stillness there is. You're building a calm, sturdy enough for a drowning child to climb onto like a raft. I'd built that raft for Caleb 10,000 times before. My body remembered how, even with my heart cracking open, because that lobby floor was every midnight kitchen floor of my entire life, arriving all at once, slowly. These things never move fast. I felt the air shift. The screaming eased, the way a pot comes down off a rolling boil. Because for the first time in that whole hour, nothing new was being added to him. One still, quiet presence had simply sat down nearby, asking for nothing. Now, about that word, and I need you to know up front it isn't magic, because people always want it to be magic. It's not. There's no such thing as a magic word. What exists, if you're paying attention, is the one thing that particular child is reaching toward beneath all the noise. While I sat there getting quiet, I'd been watching Theo. Not staring, just noticing. The way you train yourself to notice, and I caught that even mid-scream. One of his hands wasn't clamped over his ear. It rested flat against the marble, fingers tracing the same shape again and again, drawing something invisible into the stone. I looked closer and recognized it instantly, because Caleb used to trace something nearly identical. Theo was tracing a curved crescent, ringed by a scatter of small dots. Nearby, dropped somewhere in the chaos, sat a small plush toy he must have been clutching when it all began. A soft gray crescent moon with a stitched sleepy face and a handful of tiny, felt stars scattered around it. That boy, in the worst moment of his week, was reaching for his anchor, his one safe object, the moon he traced whenever the world grew too large. And not a single one of the 6 experts hovering over him had ever noticed it, because they were fixated on the problem, not on the child. They were trying to stop a behavior. I was reading a boy telling me, in the only language available to him, precisely what he needed. That's the thing I wish I could implant in the mind of anyone who's ever stood frozen over a child like this. The behavior isn't the problem. The behavior is the message. A nonverbal child isn't a silent child. He's constantly communicating through his hands, his body, his eyes, through what he reaches for and what he can't bear, through the shapes he traces and the objects he clings to. He never stops talking. The real tragedy is almost never that the child can't communicate. The tragedy is that nobody around him ever learns to read it. I learned to read it through the only textbook that ever counted, my own son's hands, across 20 years. So when Theo's fingers traced that shape into the marble, I wasn't guessing. I was reading a story written as clearly as any page, if you knew the alphabet. I quietly picked up that little plush moon and cupped it in my open palm where he could see it, not forcing it on him, just offering. I leaned in slightly and whispered the one word I knew, without doubt, mattered most to him right then. Moon. Theo went still. His fingers froze mid-trace. His head turned, just barely, toward the sound of a stranger who'd somehow known the name of his safe thing. He spotted the little plush moon resting in my palm. After one long, trembling beat, he reached out, took it, pressed it to his chest, and held on. The screaming stopped. Just like that, the storm broke, because at last, someone had spoken his language. Someone had looked at him and seen not a problem to solve, but a boy clutching his moon. Hard to put into words what washes over a child the instant the drowning ends. That shuddering, bone-deep exhale. A rigid little body going soft all at once, like a fist finally opening. I'd witnessed it on Caleb's face 1,000 times, and it undid me every single time. That instant, a child realizes he's no longer alone in the water. Theo did exactly that. Shuddered, softened, held tight to his moon. His breathing eased from ragged gasps into something close to normal. A tear slid down his face, but not a scream tear anymore, just the tail end of a storm passing through. I sat completely still beside him and let him keep that hard-earned peace. I didn't say another word, because the moment didn't need any more. It had needed exactly one, and it had gotten it. The lobby went dead silent. 6 experts, a crowd of office staff, and Renata Shaw on her knees with both hands clamped over her mouth, watching a maintenance man sit on the floor beside her now calm son, quietly rolling a plush moon between his fingers as though nothing had happened. I stayed at his level, no standing up, no taking a bow. I just kept quiet and let him hold on to that calm, because it was fragile and new and belonged to him, not me. Once he'd steadied, I rose slowly, stepped back, gave him room, and picked my toolbox back up. I still had a fixture on the 4th floor waiting to get finished. Wait. Renata Shaw's voice shook. Please, wait. She crossed over to me, this billionaire, in front of her entire company, barely able to force out the words. How? The best people in the country couldn't do that. How did you? I gave her the truth. I didn't fix him, ma'am. There's nothing to fix. I just speak a little bit of his language, that's all. I've got a son myself. 24 now. When he was Theo's age, he was standing right where Theo is, nonverbal, drowning in a world too loud for him. I spent 20 years learning to hear what he couldn't say out loud. So I understood what your boy was telling you. He'd been telling you the whole time, with his hand on that floor. He just needed somebody quiet enough to actually listen. Renata Shaw, an Empire CEO, looked at the maintenance man she'd never once spoken to in 3 years, and broke down crying. Not the desperate kind from before, something different. Relief tangled with shame and gratitude all at once. Because I think, in that moment, she realized the answer she'd been throwing millions at had been walking her halls in a gray uniform the entire time, invisible only because she'd never needed to see him. She told me later, once we'd gotten to know each other some, that what cracked her open on that floor wasn't relief exactly. It was a kind of brutal humility. She'd spent a fortune, hired the most decorated experts in the country, and the thing that finally reached her son had come from a man whose name she'd never troubled to learn, who'd worked in her building for years, whom she'd walked past 100 times without seeing. It left her wondering, lying awake that night, how many other answers to how many other problems were quietly wearing gray uniforms throughout her whole life. Invisible only because she'd assumed wisdom always dressed in a suit. She said it reshaped how she moved through her own company afterward. She started reading name patches. She started learning names. Then she remembered the offer. The $750,000 she'd thrown at the whole building in her desperation. The money, she said. I meant every word. It's yours. God, it's the very least I can do. And here's what I did. Because it's the only part of this story that genuinely matters. I turned it down. I want to be honest about why. Because it's not about nobility. I'm no saint. Just a maintenance man with a grown son and a bad back. I refused because of Caleb. 20 years back, when my boy was screaming on our kitchen floor and I was learning his language one brutal day at a time, nobody showed up to help me, and certainly nobody offered $750,000 for the trouble. I did it because he was my son, and love like that doesn't come with an invoice. What happened in that lobby sitting beside Theo was the exact same thing. I loved a drowning child for a few minutes the way I trained myself to love my own. You can't accept payment for that. The moment you do, you turn the purest act a person can offer into a transaction, and I'd sooner have stayed broke my whole life, which, mostly, I have, than let that happen to every hour I ever gave Caleb on that floor. Something else sat underneath it too, harder to put into words. If I'd pocketed that check, then every parent on every kitchen floor going forward could quietly absorb the idea, somewhere in the back of their mind, that reaching your own child comes with a price. A service the wealthy can buy and the poor can't afford. That's a lie, and a cruel one at that. What actually saved Theo wasn't expensive. It was free. Just difficult, patient, learnable, available to anybody willing to get quiet and stop thrashing. I wasn't going to let a check turn the most democratic form of love that exists into something only money could touch. So I told her to keep it, but I told her what to build with it instead. Ms. Shaw, you owe me nothing, but you've got more money than I'll ever see in a lifetime, and a boy who's going to need a whole life full of people fluent in his language. There are thousands of parents out there right now on their own kitchen floors, learning the hard way, with no help, and no money, and no hope. The way I did. Build them something. A center. A place that teaches people to actually hear kids like this, that gives families what nobody ever gave me. Put your $750,000 into that. Put 10 times that into it. Name it after your son, so wherever he goes for the rest of his life, he'll know the world finally learned his language. That's worth something. Me taking a check isn't. She just looked at me, then nodded slowly, like a piece had finally locked into place that would never come loose again. I went back upstairs and finished that fixture. I told you up front this wasn't a fairy tale, and it isn't. The truth turned out even better. Renata Shaw followed through. She didn't just write a check and feel good about it. She actually built the thing. Within a year, there was a real center, her son's name on the door, doing exactly what I described, teaching parents, teachers, therapists how to genuinely hear nonverbal kids, how to stop adding and start listening, how to get into the water and hold still, free for families who can't afford it. Last I checked, it's helped hundreds of children, and the exhausted, frightened parents who love them. Hundreds. All because a boy traced a moon into a marble floor and somebody finally noticed. I went to see it once it opened, and, honestly, I sat in the parking lot a while before I could make myself go in, already knowing what it would do to me. Inside were rooms built by people who genuinely understood. Dimmable lighting, quiet corners, spaces stripped of anything that could overwhelm a flooded little mind, staff trained to get low, get quiet, listen before fixing. Near the entrance stood a wall where families could pin up photos of their kids, already half covered with these particular, remarkable children the world had once labeled difficult, smiling in their own ways. Underneath, painted by hand, not broken, just speaking a language worth learning. I had to step back outside for a minute after reading that, because it was the exact thing I'd believed alone on a kitchen floor for 20 years with nobody there to say it back to me. Now it was painted on a wall where thousands of terrified parents would walk in on the worst day of their lives, read it, and feel, maybe for the first time, that they weren't crazy, their kid wasn't broken, and there was a path through. She did one more quiet thing that meant more to me than any check ever could. She tracked me down a few weeks later and asked if I'd help. Not as a maintenance man, but as someone who actually knew. Asked if I'd come on my own time, paid fairly like the expert I turned out to be, and train the staff there. Pass on what 20 years with Caleb had taught me. That, I agreed to. Because that's not getting paid to love a child. That's getting paid to teach others how, so fewer kids slip through the cracks. Two entirely different things, and you already know exactly which is which. I still handle maintenance. Still keep that whole building running, the wiring, the elevators, all the invisible machinery. But 2 evenings a week now, I sit in a bright room at the Theo Center teaching young parents and eager therapists the only real thing I know: how to become a calm place, how to listen to a child with no words, how to spot the moon traced on a floor. I get by fine. I'll never be rich. And I passed on $750 sitting on a marble floor. And I've never once looked back on it, because what I got instead was the chance to make 20 years of the hardest love I ever gave count for something bigger than my own kitchen. There's a version of that day where I pocket the check, get comfortable, and that center never exists, and hundreds of kids stay unheard, and I'm just some guy who got lucky once. There's no version where I take the money and still get to be the man who turned one boy's quiet moment into 1,000 other kids finally being seen. The money would have fixed my back. It wouldn't have fixed anything that actually mattered. Here's what I've come to understand that the people throwing cash around mostly haven't figured out. Love given to a child the world overlooks doesn't vanish once that child grows up. It compounds. It travels outward and finds other children. Every grueling hour I spent understanding Caleb, I assumed I was spending it purely on him. Turns out I was depositing it into an account I didn't even know existed. 2 decades later, it paid out all at once, on a marble floor, into a boy named Theo. And through him, into a center. And through that center, into hundreds of kids I'll never meet. That's the part nobody tells you about the hardest kind of love. It's never wasted. It's never just for the one person. It's the most patient investment there is, and eventually it repays the whole world, in a currency no amount of money can touch. That night I drove home and called Caleb, who's got his own apartment now with some support, working a job he loves at a plant nursery, cataloging seed stock, because his particular, remarkable brain makes him better at that work than anyone else there. My once nonverbal boy who has words now. His own careful, hard-earned words. I told him about Theo, about the moon, about that whole lobby. Caleb went quiet on the line for a beat, the way he does. Then, in his careful way, he said, "You heard him. 2 words. And I had to pull the car over because that's the entirety of it, isn't it? Everything I ever tried to do, for Caleb, for that boy on the floor, for every kid the world calls broken who isn't broken at all. Yeah, buddy, I heard him. You taught me how. So let me leave you with one question before you go. A room full of brilliant, expensive experts looked at a screaming child and saw a problem needing a solution. One invisible man in a gray uniform looked at that same child and saw a boy reaching for the moon, because he'd spent 20 years learning how to actually see. Here's what I genuinely want to know. Is there someone in your life the world calls difficult, or broken, or too much, who you've come to realize is simply speaking a language nobody around them ever bothered to learn? Tell me about them down in the comments. Say their name. I read every single one, and I'd be honored to know. If this story landed with you, if you believe, the way I've come to believe with my whole heart, that nobody is truly broken, that some people are just waiting on one other person to learn their language, do me that one favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a like so the next person can find their way here too, and leave your own story in the comments. See you in the next one. It's a good one, I promise.